Criminal law is a cornerstone of our legal system, evolving over centuries to address changing societal needs and values. Criminal law is distinct from other areas of law in that its focus is on punishing wrongdoing and protecting society as a whole, rather than resolving disputes between individuals like we see in civil law. Criminal law is characterized by several key elements, and you're going to look more at these elements in depth in your readings, but I want to take a minute to review them in a broader perspective. The first of those elements is actus reus, or a guilty act. This refers to the physical element of a crime. For example, in a theft case, the actus reus would be the taking of someone else's property, that act of taking the property. Mens rea, however, is actus reus' counterpart, and that's a guilty mind. So this is a mental element of a crime, referring to the defendant's state of mind when committing that act. So levels of mens rea include intentional, recklessness, negligence. And so we will look more in depth on what each of those mean, because any of those could get you to satisfy a mens rea element. The third piece of this is concurrence. So we have to have a guilty act and a guilty mind occurring simultaneously for a crime to have been committed. So we need both that actus reus and the mens rea. We also have to have causation. So there must be some causal link between the defendant's actions and the criminal outcome. So consider a case from England back in 1910, R versus White. A man poisoned his mother and she died in her sleep. However, it turns out that she actually had a heart attack, and that was her cause of death. Just really bad timing. The court determined that he could not be found guilty of murder because he did not actually cause her death. He was, however, found guilty of attempted murder. And then lastly, we have harm. Most crimes require some form of harm or potential harm to have occurred. So if we consider a case like R versus Cunningham, which is a case from England from 1957, we can really see a clear example of how these elements all come together and the relationship between mens rea and actus reus. So in this case, the defendant ripped a gas meter from a wall, and he was trying to steal money that was inside of it. However, when he ripped it off the wall, he inadvertently caused a gas leak that then endangered his neighbor. So this case illustrates that we have actus reus, which was removing the meter, right? He did the act. Mens rea, he had intention to steal the money, and then it resulted in harm, which was endangering the neighbor from the gas leak. And he was the cause of that. So we have all of those elements met, which is really the basis of criminal law. Now, each crime obviously looks different, and we'll get into those in more detail as the course progresses, but knowing those foundational elements can be really helpful. Now, let's consider the purpose of criminal law. The first is deterrence. General deterrence aims to prevent crime in the general population. This is what keeps all of us from committing crime daily. None of us want to go to prison or fork over our hard-earned money for fines. Specific deterrence targets an individual offender to prevent recidivism or repeating of crime. And an example of specific deterrence would be, let's say an individual has multiple DUIs. Not only would they face jail time or fines, just like any of us would, but they might also have their license revoked. They may have to attend mandatory courses on drug or alcohol abuse. They also may be required to have a breathalyzer installed on their car, which would prohibit them from driving without blowing into the device. So now we have specifically deterred this particular individual from committing that crime again. Now, is it a perfect system and we know for a fact they are never going to drink and drive again? No, but it is a deterrence on that behavior. Retribution is based on the principle that punishment should be proportionate to the crime committed. So it's not about revenge, but it's about society expressing its disapproval of criminal acts. So, for example, in Roper v. Simmons, which was a 2005 case, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty for juveniles was unconstitutional. And part of that reasoning was that it was viewed as a disproportionate punishment. Same as having the death penalty only in murder cases, right? If someone steals a candy bar from a corner store, they're not going to get the death penalty because that doesn't make sense. It's disproportionate, and the crime doesn't fit the punishment. Another purpose of criminal law is incapacitation, and this involves physically preventing criminals from committing further crimes, usually through imprisonment. So an example of this would be the Green River killer, Gary Lee Ridgway. Ridgway was convicted of 48 murders, though he confessed that there was probably double that. And so he was sentenced to 48 consecutive life terms plus 480 years without the possibility of parole. So Ridgway will not be able to commit any more killings in the general public because he's incarcerated and under close watch. The purpose of rehabilitation is to reform offenders to become productive members of society. This could include time spent in an addiction treatment center instead of being incarcerated for drug-related offenses. Rehabilitation is important for many offenders, especially ones who have already spent a great deal of time incarcerated. This could also mean helping inmates get an education while they're in prison. Studies have shown that training and education have a huge impact on recidivism rates. Criminal law clearly outlines what constitutes a crime. This includes defining elements of specific crimes and general principles like attempt, conspiracy, and accomplice liability. As we work through this course, we'll see a variety of crimes and their elements. You can consider these elements like a checklist to see if someone has committed a crime per what the law has laid out. While this course focuses on criminal law, it is important to understand that criminal procedure also plays a huge part in the criminal justice system. Criminal procedure includes rules for arrest, search and seizure, interrogation, trial processes. The exclusionary rule, which prohibits the use of illegally obtained evidence, is a crucial part of criminal procedure. Criminal law is a complex and evolving field. It really balances societal protection with individual rights. As society changes, criminal law continues to adapt. We are going to see more and more case law come out in our time as they sort of strive to maintain justice and social order in an ever-changing world.